Hi everyone. Tonight we're going to talk about government intervention in agriculture, chapter 11. Pretty easy, kind of a fun chapter. At least I think it's fun. So the government gets involved in society for many general functions. This isn't really related to agriculture, but the government provides for a lot of functions that we take for granted. The provision of law and order, national defense, infrastructure such as highways, sanitation, research, like food inspection, things like that. And these things all provide the foundation for an efficient market system that we pretty much take for granted. I think this is an appropriate time to be talking about government intervention because April 15th is right around the corner, and that's when we give Uncle Sam a lot of money. So the rationale for government intervention in agriculture. So government intervention just means government getting its nose in agriculture. Why is government involved in agriculture? One of the reasons it's not involved is to protect infant industries. That does not occur. You can read more about that in your book. I'm not going to go into it right now. But the government does get involved in agriculture to curb market powers of imperfect competitors, to promote social good. So we learned about the Federal Trade Commission. We learned about antitrust laws. That's what we're talking about here. The government also gets involved in agriculture to provide for food security. Food security means the availability of safe, wholesome, plentiful food supply. That's food security. The government also gets involved in agriculture to provide for consumer health and safety. You are probably familiar with United States Department of Agriculture. USDA has inspectors in processing plants that check for sanitation, and they check for quality and all different kinds of produce, as well as meat, eggs, poultry, things like that. And then the government also gets involved to protect the environment. And in California, we're all very familiar with that. So if we look at the problem, the original problem why government gets involved in agriculture, that has to do with the fact that agricultural goods typically are inelastic. There's an inelastic demand for agricultural goods. When you have a bumper crop, it is very difficult to get rid of surpluses. And we also know that farmers are price takers. They have very little ability to set market price. The majority of farmers operate in a purely competitive market, so they lack market power. Typically, farmers are very sensitive to trends in interest rates. Interest rates, that's the price of money. And most farmers operate on a cash basis where they have to borrow money to plant their crop or borrow money to harvest it, borrow money to buy new pieces of equipment. So as interest rates fluctuate, that makes the cost of doing business rise. And the agriculture is also involved and very sensitive to international trade conditions, because if you look at almonds, for example, we export about 70% of the almond crop, and that has a huge impact on the price that farmers receive. And that's also true for the Midwest with corn, soybeans, and wheat. And then asset fixity leads to excess capacity. Just means that farmers typically own their land, and that tends to create an opportunity to produce more, which leads to a surplus. So one of the biggest pieces of legislation and biggest things that the government gets involved with that affects agriculture is the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill was designed originally in the 1930s to help small farmers stay in business. Maybe your great-grandparents came to California when the Oklahoma and the Midwest was suffering from the Dust Bowl, and that was when the federal government started getting more involved in agriculture and preventing soil erosion and all different kinds of federal programs. So we will look at different ways that the government has tried to prevent agricultural surpluses and to get rid of agricultural surpluses. So let's look at this idea of a bumper crop. A good crop year seems like it would be a good thing since farmers are price takers. You produce more, you get a bigger check. That isn't necessarily true because of the inelastic nature of agricultural goods. So when you have a bumper crop year, you probably remember this from the chapter when we studied supply. You have, let's say this is supply in 2017 and this is supply in 2018. So you have a shift in supply, and that's caused just because of a good crop year. Good weather, good growing conditions causes that shift in supply. When you have that shift in supply, you can see that your equilibrium goes from this point at that P1 and Q1, price and quantity, to this P2 and quantity 2. So it leads to a decrease in market price. And you can see the inelastic nature of this demand curve. The price drop is very large. The quantity shift in demand is relatively small. So farmers are left with a surplus, which the only way they can get rid of is at lower and lower prices. And oftentimes that can cause farmers to go out of business. So that is the problem with the bumper crop. So this picture just shows this idea of price elasticity. And this graph is confusing. You really have to study it. So you can read what it says here. I'm going to explain it, but you can go over it a little bit more in detail if you need to. So again, we have the supply shift just like last time. And here's our original demand curve. I said this demand curve is inelastic, and that is true. This demand curve, D2, is considered to be an elastic demand curve. It's elastic because it's flat. You can see this equilibrium right here for 2017, like I said. And then the next year, 2018, same supply shift, but look, it only causes a very small decrease in price. That's a characteristic of an elastic demand curve. So the thing that you need to understand about agriculture, big agriculture, corn production, soybean production, wheat production, which is what the U.S. produces the most of. We produce a lot of specialty crops in California, and they don't necessarily fit this model. But what I can tell you is true is this demand inelasticity is typical of our domestic market. So this is the U.S. market. These are U.S. consumers. They don't purchase more of something when it comes to food. We generally, as incomes go up, we do not purchase more food. However, the export market is this curve. So export demand is much more elastic than domestic demand. So just remember, the foreign elasticity is greater than domestic elasticity. And that is important when it comes to taking advantage of different types of markets to reduce surpluses. So one of the things that I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time about this, I'll talk a little bit about it. One of the things that the federal government came up with years ago is called the Commodity Credit Corporation, CCC. And basically what the Commodity Credit Corporation did was within the USDA, they made what we call a non-recourse loan. And basically what a non-recourse loan is that they would get a loan to plant their wheat. And let's say the price of wheat fell into the tank because everyone had a good crop year and we had a bumper crop, then the federal government would take the crop in exchange for the loan. So the farmer didn't have a deficient loan payment, they didn't owe money, they just sold their crop to the federal government and they were basically at a broke even. So that is what a non-recourse loan is, and that's basically what the Commodity Credit Corporation did. So basically what this just shows is that over time, Commodity Credit Corporation was a good deal for farmers because it took a lot of risk away from farming. So the problem with that is it created this excess supply because there's only so much demand. Farmers are producing more because they had this non-recourse loan. So the problem was we accumulated a large surplus that the federal government was purchasing and storing, and consumers weren't consuming any more wheat or any more corn or any more soybeans, which are typically subsidized crops. So as time went on, this Commodity Credit Corporation started to feel the burden in the federal government of storing huge amounts of commodities. This created a lot of dissatisfied taxpayers. They felt like farmers were getting rich and off of government subsidies, and they were paying the bill, which in a way is true. So as time went on, the CCC changed their approach and provided more of a crop insurance that was based on the historical value of the crop. Another approach that the federal government has used to try to decrease production. So the Commodity Credit Corporation was this non-recourse loan where you could borrow money, and if your crop failed, you just gave your crop to the government. You didn't lose a lot of money. So another approach that the federal government tried was to manage supply by telling farmers not to plant, and not just telling them, but contracting with them to reduce production. So rice farmers in California, wheat farmers, which, those aren't our big commodities in California, but we do grow some. Those commodities were basically farmers were paid their historical value not to plant a crop. So this shifted market equilibrium like a supply shift. They have it, this curve here. The whole idea is that supply shifts from here to here. So now we are decreasing that surplus, and that creates an increase in price because now you're not flooding the market with either low-cost government purchased grain, which the federal government had to sell somehow. So now we're decreasing the amount of productivity on the part of farmers. And so the problem there is that consumers are worse off economically because prices are higher. So consumers would pay a higher price than if there was the original, amount of crop on the market, because the bumper crop leads to lower prices. And the other thing that happened was a lot of farm input suppliers really didn't like this, because think, if you're a fertilizer salesman or a tractor salesman, a farmer's being paid not to farm. So you can't sell as many tractors, you can't sell as much fertilizer, and that had a big impact on those side businesses. So that was not probably one of the best solutions to agricultural surpluses. So the current Farm Bill, which works through 2018, so we're in the makings of a new one, was basically to require farmers to purchase crop insurance. And they had to purchase crop insurance, and that was their protection against a crop failure. Like the Commodity Credit Corporation, that was a non-recourse loan. That's not the case with crop insurance. And so the federal government actually contracts with companies to provide crop insurance to farmers. And so farmers did not receive, we were phased out of the set-aside programs and the Commodity Credit Corporation. Okay, I only have a minute, so I got to zip through this. So the other thing that the Farm Bill deals with, that hopefully you'll see this, there's a good graph on the Farm Bill 101 assignment that I gave you. The current Farm Bill, about 80% of the current Farm Bill goes to nutrition and food stamps. So if you think farmers are receiving a lot of subsidies from the Farm Bill, it's not. It's the general population that receives most of the benefit from the Farm Bill. That is a very important concept. So I talked about crop insurance already. You can read a little bit more about that in your book. Another thing that the federal government has done is to encourage export market. That is demand expansion. And I'm about to run out of time, but I think I covered